Hi, welcome to the first ever Environmental Arts and Humanities Network webinar series. I'm zooming into you from Bunurong country, the land of the two bays. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this place, to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm Hayley Singer, the convener of the Environmental Arts and Humanities Network, and this webinar series invites scholars, artists and storytellers to reflect on ways that environmental arts and humanities can provoke deep engagement with, nuanced understanding of and robust community discussion about the multiple and overlapping environmental and cultural crises of our times. The Enviro Arts Network and this event is being supported by the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, and I'm really grateful to have support so that this event can take place. Today's webinar is on the global COVID-19 Quilt project, which is to be presented by Kate Just and Tal Fitzpatrick, who started and facilitate the Quilt project, and we'll also have a response from Ruth D'Souza, which is wonderful. The Global 19 Quilt project is a connected and connective work of community craftivism that narrates COVID-19's impact on our social, environmental, economic, personal and medical landscape. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I'll just explain how today's webinar will run. First, we'll hear from Kate and Tal about their project, then Ruth will offer a short response, and then we'll open up from questions from you, the audience. The questions will be managed through the chat function, so at any time throughout the hour, please put a question in the chat box and I'll try to get through all of them during our discussion time after the presentations. Okay, now to our fabulous presenters. Kate Just holds a PhD in sculpture from Monash University and is head of the Master of Contemporary Art program at the Victorian College of the Arts. Just works across sculpture, installation, neon, textiles and photography to produce contemporary artworks with feminist themes, but is best known for her inventive and political use of knitting. Tal Fitzpatrick is an artist, craftivist, researcher, arts and disability worker based in Melbourne, Australia. Driven by the power of craft to solicit the sharing of stories, her socially engaged art practice looks to drive positive change by engaging diverse groups of people in complex conversations. And she holds a PhD in visual arts from the Victorian College of the Arts. And Ruth D'Souza is a multidisciplinary educator, researcher and consultant, specialising in cross-cultural engagement, cultural safety, and the interface of digital technologies with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Her background is in nursing, where she has extensive experience as a clinician, researcher and academic in New Zealand and Australia. And she is a 2020 RMIT Vice Chancellor's Fellow based in School of Art. Okay, this is going to be a great discussion. I'm now going to hand it over to you, Kate and Tal. And yep, can't wait to hear all about the COVID-19 Quilt project.
Thanks, Hayley.
Thank you. So I think that Tal is going to share the screen. That's great. So we would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live and work. We have here the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. That's we're also on Bunurong land. I'm on Bunurong land, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present, as well as to all First Nations people right across this country and beyond. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So we, before we get going and Tal speaks to craftivism, I'll just tell you what we're going to speak about today. So as you know, this is a COVID-19 quilt webinar, and we started a virtual COVID-19 quilt on Instagram in April of this year to try to find a way to narrate and record and invite people to reflect on their everyday experiences of COVID-19 through craft. But we thought the webinar, it would be interesting to invite people to understand our process a bit better, and our background as artists and craftivists, to introduce a bit more about craftivism as a movement and a way of, as a methodology, and to understand a bit about our previous projects that led us to the COVID-19 quilt, as well as global community projects of significance that really inspired us to see that it's possible to record everyday experiences of everyday people through craft. So Tal's going to start now to introduce to you a little bit more about craftivism.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So I guess I want to preface this a little bit with the fact that, like, I identify as a craftivist, but Kate doesn't necessarily identify in the same way, but we both do work across social practice and participatory art making, with a focus of kind of integrating textiles into part of our work. But yeah, I have a bit more of a stronger focus on the actual craftivism movement, and yeah, identify more closely with being a craftivist. So let's talk about that and what that means for a second. As you can see here, I've put up a bit of a definition that I put together when I was doing my research, which was about craftivism as a process of DIY citizenship, of a kind of active, creative way to participate in the everyday practice of democracy. And you can find this in my Craftivism Manifesto, which you can get as a free PDF on my website. But yeah, so I want to really stress the fact that craftivism is a strategy for non-violent activism in my definition, which is a little bit different to some other people's imaginings of this practice. It is a form of DIY or do it together citizenship even, that looks to influence positive social change. I speak to craftivism as a uniquely 21st century practice, even though it is, of course, and obviously well grounded in a long history of people using craft as a strategy for activism and advocacy. And that's not just in the West, it's not just part of the kind of feminist movement, but it's also across almost every culture. And I think that speaks to the important role that craft practices, whether they be textile based or otherwise, the important role that they play in people's lives. So whether there are examples of historical usage of craft from, if you look at the way that Gandhi related to weaving, to the way that textiles, political textiles play a really interesting role in West African communities. There's lots of different examples across different cultures of how craft is used as part of people's kind of political lives. But craftivism in particular works at this interface of craft and digital technologies as well, which is why I think of it as a uniquely 21st century thing. There's something unique and new about this movement. The term was coined by Betsy Greer in 2013. The way that these makers integrate their digital lives and their digital communities in with their craft practices. So quickly here you can see that craftivism can take the forms of acts of donation, beautification, notification, can be deployed for its individual capacity building and therapeutic benefits. So some people come at it more for its individual psychological benefits, whereas some people come at it more about its communal capacity building and resilience building. So there's lots of different entry points to what this kind of movement might be to people. Yeah, this this again is a little something that I've kind of tried to put together to help think about how the way craft and craftivism can make change, because craftivism is often questioned for its efficacy and the impact that it makes. It seems like a very soft, non-confrontational way to engage in political life and in political activism, which some people, justifiably question. So part of the way that I like to speak to that is about thinking about craftivism beginning with an individual, finding their voice through a material discursive approach to craft and developing the confidence to share their opinion and their work with others publicly, which then begins to, our voice and our power begins to grow as we grow in confidence and we are able to connect with others. And this is really thinking about how we make change at all. Part of that process is about finding your voice, articulating what you think, connecting with like-minded people, growing your sphere of influence, joining with like-minded people to then connect and work together to then start to impact change. And I think craftivism is just one pathway through which you can do those things and find like-minded communities. Feel free to, I see you nodding, Kate, feel free to add anything. But yeah.
No, I'm okay. I'm being a timekeeper, so you keep moving.
We're going to give you some specific examples of how this kind of plays out and how it plays out in that kind of more collective participatory way that we work. So yeah, let's keep moving. I think just in like a list, the way that we can think about the kind of impacts that crafts can have is it can help us bear witness to injustice. It can help gather momentum for movements. It can be a tool for advocating for peace or for justice. It's often used as a way to memorialize, remember, or witness specific events, specific political events and moments in time, which the COVID-19 quilts very much sits within that kind of history. And it's also a way to, like I said, bring people together, both in digital and real spaces. So an example of one of the projects that I've engaged in, and that is quite nicely tied into the project that Kate and I are working on now, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights quilt, which I started with a US-based artist called Stephanie Dunlap. She's in Arizona. She contacted me via Instagram nearly 4 years ago on the dot, just after Trump's inauguration. This was during Brexit, and people were feeling, I think, a lot like what we're feeling right now, a bit overwhelmed. And she wanted to do something about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we decided to collaborate. I'd never met her, or via Instagram. And we decided that we'd embroider the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We put a call out through Instagram to see if anyone else wanted to help us, because it's long and it would have taken us a really long time. And we were really amazed that over 131 people from 21 different countries around the world wanted to be a part of this project. So instead of kind of picking the best 30 people to make the best possible quilt, we decided we'd just let anyone who wanted to be a part of the project be a part of the project. We had the call out open for a week, and in that time we had enough people sign up to make the quilt 4 times over. So you can see here 4 2x2 meter quilts that each have all 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights embroidered onto them, as well as each artist's own exploration of a human rights issue that was important to them. So if we look at details of the quilt, you can see that people have used their squares to tell specific stories about specific human rights issues and human rights violations going on around the world. And an important part of my own practice is layering the work so that it operates in different ways. So it wasn't just about people expressing themselves through this quilt. We exhibited this quilt at the Museum of Australian Democracy for over a year. So it was part of a big exhibition where people got to look at and learn about this project. And we also raised money. So we raised $26,200 for UNHCR to support refugees and asylum seekers by selling these quilts and donating all that money. So you can start to see how craftivist projects can operate on multiple different levels as a way to make change. But that's enough about me, so I'm going to hand back over to Kate so she can talk about some of her projects that, again, led up to the COVID-19 quilt project.
Thanks, Tal. So yeah, I suppose I just will speak to one project I've done, which I think began to inform my sense of the possibility of working with non-artists collaboratively and using craft to address social change. And this project is the Knit Hope project. And there were two projects that ran concurrently over a year, Knit Hope and Knit Safe. And both were community participatory knitted banners, which were knitted with night reflective silver thread and also builder's line. So using kind of urban, almost construction kind of fabrics that are seen in the outside environment, like worn on cyclists or construction workers and the like, to create these knitted banners that spell hope and safe and speak to women's agency and safety in public space. The works were a response to the issue of violence against women around the globe. And yeah, it was just a way of bringing people together at a time where there had been a number of known cases, murders and assaults in public space, and understanding people really needed a kind of space to come together and to work through their own feelings about this. And so you could see in the previous picture that Tal showed just those squares, so everybody was able to knit their own square in any pattern or stitch that they wanted to. So it was like every little square of the banner reflected the makers themselves. So it's a way of finding yourself in the greater fabric of the work at the end of the project as well. Yeah, I suppose for me, this began, I had worked as an artist, as a solo artist, working with knitting and making large-scale sculptural and pictorial works. And it was around the time where I adopted my first child. I have two children adopted out of the foster care system, that I think I began to just think a lot more socially about the world and thinking about how as an artist I could bring other people into my practice and into the work and invite them to see how craft is a way of narrating your own experience and the desire for change. So I think that's enough on that project. And then, of course, I guess the only other thing to mention about that is that part of the work was then about taking the works into public space, so walking with the banners. And it's another way of kind of performing the agency of the work with communities of people. And so the other thing we were going to talk about today, and if you can go to the next slide, Tal, please, is memorials or major craft projects around the globe that have kind of inspired our thinking with the COVID-19 quilt. So one of the projects that's always inspired me, and I was a kid when this was developed, I was a 10-year-old, was the NAMES quilt, or the AIDS Memorial Quilt. So it's often abbreviated to the AIDS Memorial Quilt or AIDS Quilt, and it's an enormous memorial that celebrates the lives of people who've died of AIDS-related causes. It's just a huge work, and to see it, to see individual people memorializing their loved ones in this way really is a testament to the power of everyday people participating in what is such an affecting global issue. And so, yeah, this is one of the works for me that's always inspired me in my practice and made me really understand that non-artists or crafters who are often not necessarily valued in the same way as artists are actually a really important part of our broader artistic and creative culture, and the value of kind of including that into, I think, broader art world and academic kind of context is really important. We just go to the next one. That's a detail of it. And the great thing about this quilt is that it's now digitized online, so you can actually zoom in and view every single square of the quilt. So it's interesting to see how something that was once a tangible work which you had to visit personally is now also digitized. So understanding that the virtual and digital space becomes a part of most projects like this eventually.
Yeah, and it's interesting, particularly with this quilt, is with this project, is it got to the point where it was so big that it can't physically be installed in its entirety in a physical space. So this kind of digital display of the work is the only way you can see the project in its entirety, because it is the biggest communal art project ever, which is really amazing.
And so, yeah, maybe you could speak to these ones.
Yeah, I again just wanted to stress that it's not that using craft as a strategy for activism and advocacy and to memorialize and pay attention to moments as they happen in time is not something that's exclusive to a Western culture or to white makers. So I've just got a couple of examples actually from South America of how different groups of still largely women have used their textile practices as a way to address what was happening in their lives. So the Chilean apparellas from Chile are one of the most kind of historically significant examples of how craft has been used in this way. And you can see here just one example of a collection of hundreds of works that were made during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, which was documenting the violence and the disappearance of people in the communities. And one of the only ways these communities were able to get out this information to the rest of the world was to actually smuggle these textile works out of the country through church groups. And this was one of the only sources of information that the outside world had for a while about what was happening. So it's a really interesting example of how the fact that craft is often dismissed and seen as non-threatening can be part of its power, because it can be used in this kind of Trojan horse way to avoid scrutiny, particularly in contexts where there's real danger if you're doing this kind of recording work of what is happening. So another example, a more contemporary example from Chile, is this project that was started by an artist called Lillian, who worked with lots of different artists to kind of bring attention to the fact that there were lots of eye injuries happening during sustained protests, which were again denouncing the president of Chile at the time. So yeah, much more contemporary example of how this work continues outside the West as well as in the West. And this is a really important example from Mexico of another project that is memorializing the loss of people to violence, in this case violence as a result of the Mexican-American war on drugs and of the drug cartels. So it's a project that involves one napkin being sewed per person lost to this kind of violence, and it's installed in public spaces, particularly on the last day of the President Philippe's presidency. They had a really big installation in multiple places across the country and in Mexico City that kind of brought attention to this violence and to the loss that these communities have experienced.
Thanks. So I'll keep speaking now. So to the next slide, which is the monument quilt. So the monument quilt is a crowdsourced collection of thousands of stories from survivors of rape and abuse. And the quilt involves a collection of survivors' stories stitched, written, and painted onto red fabric. This quilt, I'm just trying to remember the year. I believe it was in 2019. That's right, May to June 2019. And it was also, like the Names Memorial quilt, was laid out on the mall in Washington, D.C. And it was the only time the quilt was displayed in its entirety. It was co-founded by a collective of women and non-binary people, and it was initially launched in 2013 as a project and developed over 6 years. Again, just a really incredible and moving example of the ways a community can record a significant experiences of a personal nature, but also of a broader cultural issue that needs to be addressed and is ideally addressed collectively and through kind of personal narratives and solidarity. So I think that we are now at the COVID-19 quilt project. And so what we've done is there's a video that we've created for a museum display of the quilt, which will be primarily a digital representation. And so we'll share that now, and it tells you a bit more about it. So we'll speak through the video as well. So it's a participatory project we started in April of this year. It arose from Tal and I really having a phone conversation about the possibility for craft to be a way of addressing the pandemic. So we'd worked together before on projects, and I also had supervised Tal's craftivism PhD. So we had a kind of shorthand relationship and understanding of each other's practices, and just felt like really natural way of working together. So yeah, essentially it's working in a way where it's inviting people to submit a square that is textile edge to edge. So it fills the whole of the square that would be posted on Instagram. And then with that, they share a text about their experience of COVID-19 or also the work itself. So this will show you a few examples of some of those texts. You can jump in anytime also, Tal.
Yeah, I just want to give people the chance to read them, because I guess what's really beautiful about this project is that it's, you know, as you scroll through the feed, that's the quilt per se, but then you can click into each square and get these beautiful details about what people are going through at that particular moment in time in response to the pandemic, how it's affecting their lives. And we've got people from all around. There's 27 different countries represented on the quilt as we speak, and nearly 500 submissions that we've collected since April, with people just finding out about the project and sending us a direct message. So it's super informal. We wanted to keep the barriers to entry really low. We did a lot of work trying to translate the invitation to participate in the project into multiple languages, including sign language, when you'll see when that slide comes up. And the idea too was not to ask people to create something new in specific response to this project, but to actually just share what they were already making. Because being part of the online digital crafting kind of community, we knew that we would be in this moment returning to the processes of making as a way to deal with our anxiety, to fill in this time that we had while we were all in lockdown all of a sudden, to kind of help us process and help us communicate what we were doing. And we had a hunch, you know, that's what we were doing. So we had a hunch everyone else was doing it too. And we wanted to create a space where we could bring those together so they could be in conversation with each other. And it really has become that. It's become this lovely space of kind of its own little community where the artists support each other and speak to each other and respond to each other's works as they are posted, to each other's stories. And we can start to see the kind of synergies and the differences between how this global pandemic is impacting people around the world in similar and different ways. And I think that's been comforting and also educational. We've done a bit of learning through this project about you know, the differences. As you can see here, we've got China and Brazil, lots of different places that have been impacted in different ways. So it's been really, it's been a really informative project to follow along and be a part of, in that we're getting to learn more about how this pandemic is impacting people around the world.
Yeah, and this is the section where, as you say, Tal, there's different languages. It's hard to see probably on a small screen on the particularly the left side panel, but languages are shared in stories, inviting people from around the world to share it as well as access it, so to share it in their own communities. And the posts are then also appearing in multiple languages, sometimes translated and sometimes not. So it's really the choice of the people as they submit, and it's a snapshot of a global community.
And we're going to keep this project going as long as the global pandemic continues. And it's been interesting to see how it ebbs and flows in different places around the world as different communities experience second waves, third waves. So we see some communities go kind of silent as things go back to normal in some places. And then, you know, we had a lot of submissions from Melbourne recently, obviously, as we were in a more severe lockdown, and we're starting to see more submissions now from places like England and America as they see a rise in cases happen. So and the thing that's also really important about this project is it's not just about the pandemic itself. It's also bringing attention to, as you can see here, the other events that have been happening at the same time as this, or which have been exacerbated by the pandemic itself. So things like domestic violence, we've seen a lot of research come out about the increase in violence and people being unsafe in their homes, which is a real issue as a result of lockdowns. We've seen a resurgence in things like the Black Lives Matter movement because of the way that this has disproportionately affected communities of colour in some places, and how that's kind of intersected with other political issues that are happening. So it is becoming this really interesting record of what is happening in this time, which I think we'll look back and remember as quite a significant moment in history.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because as it started, it's tracked through so many responses. Like initially, as you just saw, the humorous ones that were coming up, initially there was a kind of a bid to kind of find the humor in it. But as time has gone on and we've recognized it's really stretching over what maybe years of our lives, altering our lives in all kinds of ways: health, economics, employment, access to family, all kinds of things are dramatically impacting people's lives and their nations that they are living in. And also the kind of the government handling is so different in different countries around the world. And so people's experience is often if you're living in a place where the government is handling COVID-19 really badly, this is something that's like a kind of ongoing oppression where you can't really escape the impact in any way, and it's not being managed properly as well. So what we're seeing in the quilt is that people are really recording the truth as well. So they're recording what's happening in their own place and their own life in a way that is going to hopefully be an ongoing record. And so at the moment it's virtual, which allows it to be shared really widely, but we're also looking at possibilities for publication as a way of holding it as a more permanent record in many years to come.
And we think it's really important to kind of use this as a document and to find ways to ensure that it is documented, perhaps beyond the life of the Instagram platform itself. Like, who knows how long that's going to be a thing, but we want these experiences of people, that this document, to continue to exist, partially because these are the kinds of stories that are often underrepresented and underrecorded and kind of left forgotten because they are largely everyday people, largely women, who are kind of sharing their experiences. and also, yeah, because these records have historically not existed or lasted the duration of time. So I think it's important to us to find ways to make sure that this gets recorded and remembered going forward.
That's right. And I think just before we go to Ruth, just inviting anyone who's here in the audience who wants to still participate in the COVID-19 quilt, that you can share with us a square via direct message or email us at covid19quiltproject.com, a short text about your work, who you are, the city and country you're from, and yeah, just a little square pic of your textile, and we can post in the feed.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate and Tal. And Ruth, we'll bring you in now to offer a short response. And just a reminder, if anybody has questions that you'd like to put in the chat box, please feel free. We'll get into a discussion shortly. Thanks so much, Ruth.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Just want to acknowledge that I'm here as an uninvited guest on unceded land on Western Port, land of the Bunwarang. Wow, what amazing work you've done, and thank you so much for the opportunity to respond to this wide-ranging and really generous talk from two amazing people who've created a space for something remarkable. 5 minutes, eh? I'll do my best. Those that know me know that I'm not very good at 5 minutes, but I'll do my best. I love how craftivism offers sites of resistance that serve as innovative strategies to challenge inequalities. The way that your projects have brought people together, the slowness of making and mindful activism, which I think is rather a beautiful contrast to loud or fast activism. And even as I'm thinking that, I think about how during COVID I've just become very energetic and motivated in my garden, and that kind of desire to kind of regenerate and rejuvenate that I think is very present. So it was just such a beautiful time to be doing a project like this, you two. I also loved your points about having a voice which can become collective, and also the ways in which there's a challenge to capitalism and mass media. I really liked how you both acknowledged the global movement of craftivism and histories. And when you were talking about Gandhi, Tal, because I'm from India, from Goa specifically, but I think of that really iconic, amazing photograph of Gandhi with a spinning wheel. And in that image, you see this activation of an anti-colonial politics where Gandhi is saying, buy khadi, buy our local cloth, that's homespun, but also disrupting the idea that spinning and making are primarily, female gendered tasks. I've got a few questions about inclusion that I want to throw into the mix, and I guess they're part of a maybe broader critique that I'm interested in around whose handiwork is vastly undervalued and who's seen as revolutionary and kind of posted as a form of refusal. And I guess I'm thinking about who can participate, and particularly Tal, because I'm really interested in that kind of nexus of digital and participation. And, this is where my own work is kind of being expressed at RMIT in my fellowship. And I guess I think a lot about what the conditions for participation are. And I guess I'm thinking about time, money to make the digital haves and have-nots, how this sort of communication about craftivism and craft happens via social media and the internet, who has access to and knowledge of the activity. So it was beautiful to hear about, your attempts to translate information, including sign language. And I guess when I think about craftivism as a response to the exclusion of feminist practices in the context of art and craft, and how craftivism is seen as giving visibility to people who identify as women, their labor. But I think the discussion has taken place in the context of white women, particularly in settler nations, and doesn't come from the struggles of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so I want to sort of unpack a little bit very quickly about how inclusion is good, but how we might think about including the other into this history. And I'm thinking about the Aids quilt and how quilt making as memorial carries histories of exclusion as well. So even as the Aids quilt was trying to change the centering of the white gay male voice, it recentered it. And if we look beyond the rectangles of brightly patterned cloths, the quilt has been critiqued as a colorless amalgam because of its homogenizing leveling of names and overwhelming whiteness. So only about 500 panels of the current 49,000 are for Black men, and there are fewer for Black women. And it's kind of shocking, given that African Americans bear the most severe burden of HIV of all racial and ethnic groups in the US. And so one of the things that I wonder about is that how this legacy around how we live with those kind of histories and how things are inaugurated. And then, you know, when I was thinking about archiving and your comments, Kate, I was thinking about how we can't change that history, and then how we might think about decolonizing institutions like health, which I'm really familiar with, and educational services, is that it's really difficult to turn something into something else. And what do we do with that history and how things look at different times? So I think, you know, how we understand histories and know what we can do with them is something that's really interesting to me. And then in concluding, I'm kind of interested in how intentions can overcome the sort of structural and ideological constraints that can undermine true inclusion. So those are my kind of key points, really. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was just wonderful.
Amazing.
Kate and Tal, I'll hand that directly back over to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that question about inclusion is a really important one. And what I've been challenged about in my own thinking about inclusion is that inherent in even that word inclusion is the idea that someone has the power to include or exclude. And I think as we move forward and as we think about better addressing our histories of white supremacy and colonial histories, we need to move away from this idea that we have power to choose to include or exclude people according to how much we can be bothered to do that, and really think about what it means to give power away, to do projects that are based on different levels of power hierarchies and are more about centering the voices of others, centering the misrepresented, underrepresented voices in ways that aren't about us still controlling that. And I guess that's something in my own practice that I'm always trying to challenge myself on and think about how do you lead projects? How do you lead a practice that is centering the voices of others and kind of leveraging your own power to give power away without kind of falling into the trap of being some kind of white savior or something. It's a complex ground, but I guess the work is to do the work and to think about that, and to recognize just the truth of these histories and the fact that this exists. But also, I think it's really important to to also remember the fact that even though they're not as well celebrated, they're not as well discussed, they're not as well documented, the histories of using craft as a process of resistance, or just as a process of survival, of thriving under these kind of colonial and white supremacist institutions, has always existed. And communities of colour have traditionally more strongly relied on their craft practices to survive, and to, you know, whether it was making their own clothes, or you know, creating quilts to raise money for the civil rights movement. These communities have always engaged in these practices. We just haven't necessarily thought about or framed them in the same way that we think about the way that it has been done in our own communities of white colonial folk.
I just wanted to say also thank you so much, Ruth, as well, for your comments. And when you were talking, I thought, when you're talking about the Aids quilt, I thought immediately, and I wish I had included it, and I'll put the link in the chat, of the Gee's Bend community of quilters, mainly African-American women quilters, and that history of incredible works they produce. Because if I would name probably my top 10 list of artworks, the quilts in the Gee's Bend collection, I reckon, are like better than all of those modernist male painters who get all the props and all the cash. And it's such an important record that's now finally being recognized as probably one of the most significant quilting communities in the world in terms of artistic kind of contribution and resilience. Yeah, so thank you, because as you spoke, I just immediately remembered that and wished I had included it. That was really incredible response for 5 minutes.
And there are also examples of First Nations peoples and Indigenous peoples from all around the world who engage in craft as a means of survival and as a way to support themselves and their communities, and to sustain history and language and culture as well. But it's yeah, so I think we need to acknowledge that these things are happening, and bring them into the fold and into the conversation, as opposed to constantly centering the projects that center white voices and white experiences.
Thank you so much. Well, we're still waiting for some questions to come through from the audience. And while we do, I have one question, if it's okay for me to jump in here and ask. I was going back through, I've been following the quilt since it started in April, and before this presentation I was going back through and just rereading the squares, the quilts themselves, but also the captions that come with them. And one thing that really stood out for me that I wasn't expecting when I first started to engage with it was the citational politics of the quilts, and having also the sort of caption function that exists within Instagram. And it opened me up to so much literature and music that I'm just not generally engaging in. And I really wondered, Tal, Kate, Ruth, have you found things that you just did not expect to come out of this community project? Is there anything that's been really sort of surprising for you or for the community who are engaging with this?
Well, it's funny, I'm not surprised by it, because I think it's surpassed actually maybe my expectations in terms of the global engagement with it. I think that, and the speed of that, but in a way it reflects what I thought it would, which is that it really is just daily life observations of people living in very different conditions. And which, as you say, Ruth, one of the biggest issues in a project like this, of course, is then the very idea that it is digital, because as soon as it's one of the benefits and the exclusions inherent in it is like, there's a lot of people who don't have the internet. And even if you say, well, actually, you can submit on behalf of someone who's on the internet, well, you're still depending on the internet, and there's a huge global community of people who aren't on the internet. So it isn't a totally comprehensive picture of real experience, because the people who aren't on the internet, what's their experience of the pandemic? What's their experience of being able to connect beyond their lockdown or their government handling of a situation? So there are those issues still within it. But I feel like it didn't surprise me inherently. It delights me every day to read a new narrative from someone and a window into someone's life.
Yeah, and there are, I think it's really important to point out that we acknowledge the limitations of this project, and that the fact it is bound by the internet means that it is inherently, constrained by its reach in that sense.
Well, thinking of its sort of possibilities and constraints, I have a question from Alison Young, who's asked if you all could talk about the differences between the visual and the tactile, given that the Instagram representation is visual rather than tactile, although the original works will have all that significance in terms of its tactile character.
Well, I guess like we actually, in a sense, knew that there was a disconnect between the visual and the tactile, but it's one of the foundation points of the project, in the sense that what we thought is we're deprived of a kind of tactile engagement in COVID. You can't touch anyone, you can't leave your house, you're sort of actually very compressed in some of the your experiences, and you're lacking a sense of touch and tactility. So the project existed as a way of virtually trying to enact that, to connect people, to touch their hands virtually through this kind of tiling of the quilts. But of course, we know as crafters that the tangible material experience of holding and looking at something and its representation through a digital screen is completely different. So what we're kind of relying on is actually each maker's experience of their own work, and their experience in making it, of having a kind of access to that encounter, and then sharing that, and we know that they are having that in their own home, in a sense. And you sort of do feel that. You do feel that in the way that people speak about their work as well. So it's kind of, it's requiring you to make the connection mentally almost, or emotionally, without actually having it in your hand.
And considering that the majority of our audience for this project are a community of makers, I think there's a lot of recognition of what that feels like tactilely. Makers can look at a thing and then imagine the process and the feeling of pulling that thread or clicking those needles. I think we're able to imagine that as a community of makers as we see these visual cues. Sorry, Ruth, go ahead.
Oh, no, not at all. I just think it's a fantastic question, because I'm doing research virtually at the moment, and like all the issues I raised in the context of this project are issues I'm actually examining myself, because I'm doing a project about older people, social isolation and COVID, and how they're accessing services. So I've been talking to people who don't have the internet at home at all, and have no friends, which is devastating. Like, I've interviewed them on the phone, and then I'm talking to other people who are emailed me the consent form back signed and scanned. So, there's this massive range in capacity. But one of the things that I'm doing in this research is using photo elicitation, because I can't go to people's homes and interview them. And I was talking to someone from an aged care facility, and this is a slight distraction, but I'm interested in this question. And she'd been doing her PhD about Germans that came to Australia post-war. And she went to interview this man, and he said, "I'm not German, I'm Australian." And she was asking him about aging back then. He says, "I'm not German, I'm Australian." And she looked around the house, and it's like, there's cuckoo clocks and everything that reminded her of someone German, And that's the thing that I'm really missing in this research. So, so I've asked people to take photos, but I still feel like, the lens of the camera is so reduced, and I'm really missing this other social big picture, Yeah. And I kind of wonder about this, really as a way of stopping us all in our tracks, some kind of slow activism, that's involved in making, whether COVID, this giant interruption that we've had, has really brought very close to us and into sharp relief the limitations of the virtual, and I'm really grateful for that, because I think we've had such a push in so many ways that this is the thing that's going to be good for all of us, and finding that it's not. But that's a massive distraction from your wonderful conversation. But I do want to problematize that, and I think it's a really great kind of question.
And layered onto that is that kind of public-private nexus happening as well during this time, where, and in the project as well, the quilt images, they're kind of a little private window into people's lives, their emotional lives, their creative lives, that we don't see in public spaces, but we see in this kind of digital public space. And I think it's the same even with this kind of Zoom platform, where seeing little tiny pinhole windows into people's lives, into their homes, into their pets and their families. So I think, it's a really interesting time to think about this kind of personal, private, public, tactile, digital. Like, we're in this really weird kind of third space almost.
Absolutely. Look,
we have other questions. Sorry.
We do. I was about to say we're at time, but I have one question in the Q&A box, which is the climate crisis something that we can address through craftivism? Acknowledging that we are sort of now at midday, I don't want to shut this question off. I would like to hear your responses to it. So yeah.
I feel like I'm going to let Tal take this one, because I bet you already know about some projects that have attempted this.
I think this is actually like a really, really central question to a lot of practitioners. A lot of makers, just more broadly, makers and tinkerers are people who look to use and reuse. And we've seen it in the COVID-19 quilt project, where people have, particularly because in a lot of places like Spotlight is closed, they've had to look to what's around them and think about how they can remake and upcycle and reuse. And I think that within the craft and craftivism community, there's a lot of thinking about textile waste in particular. That is a real passion for people, about fast fashion, which is a really big passion for people within the craftivism community, around the idea of challenging the capitalist model of fast fashion and of having clothes made in developing countries for and all of that. So there's a lot of thinking going on into that space, as well as people who are making work that speaks more directly and interacts with the natural world more directly. So at the other end of the scale, thinking about the way that people are returning to natural dyeing, and farm to table version of craft, which is kind of happening. So there is a lot of work in that space. Again, really interesting space to problematize with issues of access, particularly class, the idea that these things just start to become really expensive, accessing natural materials, doing these kind of natural dyeing processes makes things like yarn really expensive. And then you have that question of like, well, who can access that? So it's complex as always, but there is a lot of thinking, a lot of people working in that space for sure.
Thank you so much.
I knew you'd get that one.
And maybe
all over it.
And maybe that's just such a great point, this idea that there's just so much more thinking and talking that we can and need to do. Hopefully one day, not as tiny head boxes, but as tactile, fleshy beings where we can bump elbows and hug in a not too distant future. I really want to thank you all for your intellectual and creative generosity of what you've brought here today. It's felt really special. Thank you everybody for having patience with us as we got our closed captioning sorted out. That was a big learning event for us, and we will do better. Thank you very much for the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute for supporting this event. next Friday, we have another webinar happening on feminism in a climate emergency to be presented by Lara Stevens. And we hope that you can join us for that. Details for that will be emailed out, but also will be online. But I just want to thank you, Ruth, Tal, and Kate, once again, for giving us your time and your generosity. And happy Friday. Finally, I've never figured out how to exit the Zoom room.
I did just want to add, Robert just reminded me in the Q&A that the Knitting Nanas Against Gas and Greed are a really amazing Australia-based climate-driven craftivist collective. If you want to start your research, they're a good place to start. But yeah.
And maybe, oh, sorry, Tal. I love this lag of Zoom. And maybe the five of us could just stay and have a quick chat while everyone else leaves before we go.
That sounds good.
Everybody else.
Everybody else.
Nope,
Go
we're
bye-bye
being
now.
exclusive now.
I know. We're like, don't exclude, but okay, everybody goodbye.
Yeah, bye. Sorry.
You can find us on Instagram if you want to continue this chat at COVID-19 Quilt, or both Kate and I are up there and we're always up for a chat. So please feel free to hit us up.
Thank you for listening, everybody.
And you're also up for People's Choice Award, the COVID-19 Quilt.
Oh yeah, for the
Integrate.
for the incinerator award.
Yeah, if you want to vote for us, I think you can still vote.
I voted yesterday. I'm feeling good.
Oh. Better go and vote.
Yeah, that would be nice, wouldn't it? I wonder when are they announcing that?
It was supposed to be closed by the start of November. I've been checking it every day. But yeah, the voting is still open, so I don't know what they're doing. All right, I'm going to turn my camera off and let people leave. And then we can chat.
Yeah, that's a good idea, and then we can turn back on.